Maya leaned against the cafe table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Across from her sat her friend Claire, who fidgeted with the zipper on her coat. The small cafe was warm, the hum of conversations filling the air, but Claire's face was tense, her eyes darting towards the window as if searching for an escape. "I just don't know if I can keep doing this," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's been so hard since the breakup. Every day feels heavy, you know?" Maya nodded empathetically, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "Oh, I totally get it. I felt the same way when I broke up with Ryan last year. It was like carrying this huge burden around all the time. I remember not even wanting to get out of bed some mornings." Claire blinked, her lips parting slightly, but she didn't interrupt. "And then," Maya continued, leaning forward, "I started doing yoga, and it really helped. Have you tried yoga? That's what got me through it. Well, that and journaling. I was writing these long emotional entries every night. Honestly, it was such a transformative time for me. Looking back, I think the breakup was actually the best thing that ever happened to me." Has this ever happened to you? You're having a rough time and you need a listening ear. But instead of listening, your confidant, your friend, your parent, or loved one, launches into their version of your challenge. Welcome to my podcast on how not to retire, a psychological approach to a healthy and wealthy retirement. Episode 34, 8 Listening Obstacles. Greetings, I'm your host, Dr. Richard Himmer. Now we're going to get back to our story. So remember, Claire's fingers are tightened around her coffee cup, and she's talking and telling Maya a story about her challenges. And Maya decides that she's going to relate. She's going to let Claire know that she knows what it's like from her perspective. Claire's fingers tighten around her cup of coffee. She forced a small smile, her gaze flickering down into the table, and then she just utters, "That's nice." Maya did not notice the strain in her voice. Right? It's just one of those things you never see clearly until you're on the other side. Like at first, I thought my life was over, but now I realize how much better off I am. You'll get there too, Claire. Trust me. Claire nodded, but said nothing. She sipped her coffee, her eyes fixed on the swirling foam at the top. Maya tapped her fingers on the table, her enthusiasm undimmed. "You know what else helped? Talking to my mom. She's so wise about these things. She told me, 'Maya, sometimes people leave your life to make room for something better.' Isn't that such a great way to think about it? Like, maybe this is your chance to finally focus on yourself. Have you thought about that?" Claire's shoulders stiffened. "I guess," she said, her voice flat. Maya tilted her head, oblivious to the growing distance in Claire's tone. "I know it doesn't feel like it now, but trust me, you'll look back on this and see it as a blessing in disguise. I mean, I've been there." As a general rule, this is where the conversation ends. Claire bottles her frustration up, she doesn't hold a boundary with Maya, and goes home feeling utterly empty, wishing she had a friend with some emotional intelligence skills. So let's try a different take on this situation, one where Claire airs her voice about Maya's behavior. I'll repeat the last part of the one-way relating monologue from Maya to get us started. Maya tilted her head, oblivious to the growing distance in Claire's tone. "I know it doesn't feel like it now, but trust me, you'll look back on this and see it as a blessing in disguise. I mean, I've been there." Claire set her coffee cup down a little too firmly. "Yeah, but it's not the same, Maya." Maya blinked, startled by the sharpness in Claire's voice. "What do you mean?" Claire sighed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's just, I'm not ready to hear about how things get better or how it worked out for you. I'm trying to tell you how I feel right now, and it's not the same as what you went through. I don't need solutions or stories about how you handled it. She trailed off, her eyes pleading. "I just need someone to listen." Maya sat back, stunned, Her mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came out. For the first time since the conversation began, she realized how much space she had taken up, how her attempts to relate had drowned out Claire's voice. The silence between them felt heavy. Claire glanced at her watch and then stood, slinging a bag over her shoulder. "I should go. Thanks for meeting with me," she said, her tone polite but distant. Maya watched her leave, door closing quietly behind her. The warmth of the café suddenly felt stifling. She picked up her tea, but it had gone cold. For the first time, she replayed the conversation in her mind and saw it differently. In her eagerness to connect, she had unknowingly pushed Claire away. Maya had wanted to help, but instead, she had made the conversation about herself. She sat there for a long time, staring into her mug, wondering how to make it right. So I'm going to give you kind of an expanded moral of the story to help put in context what just happened here. Sometimes the best way to support someone is not by relating to their experiences, but simply listening. And I'm going to amend that. It's almost never good to relate, rather to listen. Sitting with their emotions and being present and allowing someone to share without interrupting demonstrates empathy and builds trust. However, this is only half the lesson. The other half comes from the courage it takes to address the issue head on, as Claire did. So position 1 is her friend Maya. Position 2 is Claire's. If they do violate your boundary and are not listening, are not a friend, invite them to that behavior. It's an emotional intelligence skill set. The other one, constant relating, is an addiction. It is addictive in nature. I'll go into that just a little bit later. In many cases, people like Claire do remain silent. They leave the conversations feeling unheard, misunderstood, or even invalidated. Instead of speaking up, they internalize their frustration, and then it festers, and it allows the relationship, even invites the relationship to drift apart. But Claire's decision to protect her emotional boundary by calmly and assertively explaining her feelings is a rare and essential step towards a healthier communication experience. Do you remember the quote by Richard Rohr? There's two halves to life. There's the first half and the second half, but you can't really go through the second half of life with the first half of life skill set. You need a new toolkit. I kind of summarize that. This is what I'm talking about. Claire's response highlights a very important skill. That is asserting boundaries in relationships. It's difficult to tell someone, especially a friend, that their approach isn't helpful. It takes emotional intelligence and courage to say, "Hey, I need you to listen, not fix or relate." In doing so, Claire not only protected herself from further frustration, but also allowed Maya to grow. It was an invitation to grow. By explaining her perspective, Claire helps Maya recognize a blind spot in her communication style, a habit, if you will, that even though it's well-meaning, it actually causes harm. This is what makes the ending of the Maya and Claire story so unusual. Most people in Claire's position are just quiet. They don't say a thing, but they go away frustrated, right? The conversation is draining, and it reinforces this miscommunication pattern or habit in their relationship. Claire's willingness to speak up breaks the cycle. While it may have created an awkward moment, it's a temporary moment. It also planted the seed for a deeper, more meaningful relationship, one where both parties can better understand and meet each other's needs. While often intended as a form of connection, relating during conversations can become a blind spot or even a behavioral addiction, as earlier alluded. It's the reflexive urge to redirect the focus of the conversation to your own stories, your own feelings or experiences. This habit is not inherently malicious, but it stems from a desire to bond or to help. However, when it happens too often, it can leave others feeling ignored or overshadowed. And because the internal drugs produced are opioids, the behavior becomes addictive. Understanding this blind spot is crucial for fostering better relationships. Relating should be balanced and situational. In moments when someone needs emotional support or validation, listen neutrally without jumping in to share your own experience. That can be far more valuable than attempting to relate. So as we move into different stages in life, such as retirement, the opportunities to spend time with loved ones and friends increases. These moments are perfect opportunities to reflect on and improve our communication skills. Unfortunately, emotional intelligence and boundary setting are rarely taught explicitly, yet they are essential for maintaining and creating healthy relationships. So let's just consider the stakes. Divorces happen regularly. Family disputes, even estate battles, all stem from poor communication skills. Misunderstandings, unmet expectations, and unspoken frustrations often escalate because individuals lack the tools to express their needs effectively or understand the perspective of others. Mastering emotional intelligence involves 4 key steps. 1, active listening. That means that you focus on the speaker's words, their emotions, and the intent without planning your response or interjecting. Number 2, recognize your blind spots. Identify habits like constantly relating or interrupting and work to minimize them. Number 3, setting and respecting boundaries. This is tough. Be like Claire. Learn to assert your needs calmly and constructively. And if you're Maya, learn to accept feedback without defensiveness or getting offended. And in today's world, where getting offended is a badge of honor, it's just not healthy. Number 4, finally, practice empathy, which means to understand the other person's perspective through their eyes, not through your own. That's different than putting yourself into their shoes. By staying neutral and trying to understand their point of view, you avoid biasing the story. Now, the story we just shared of Maya and Claire is a reminder of how rare it is to receive honest feedback about our communication habits. Most people who feel unheard simply withdraw. But if they were to voice their concerns, like Claire did, it could lead to profound growth for both parties. Improving communication is a lifelong journey. Every conversation is an opportunity to practice. By listening neutrally, which rarely does anybody do that because it's never been talked about, by respecting boundaries, again, another rarity, it's just not done very often, and cultivating emotional intelligence, which we talk about it nowadays, but we really don't know what it means, we build stronger, more fulfilling relationships with friends, family, and basically anyone we encounter. You may wonder, why are you sharing this concept with me? I'm about to retire, or I am retired. Well, the answer is very straightforward. You can teach an old dog new tricks. I've met, coached, and observed far too many couples who've been married for 30, 40, even 50 years constantly struggle with effective communication. Being married to someone for a long time does not make you an effective communicator. In fact, you may become so comfortable in your dysfunctional way of communicating that you're not aware of how dysfunctional you really are. People become so accustomed to this dysfunctionality of the way they get along, they don't know what they don't know. It's always been this way, and you literally fear, doing anything different that would upset what you perceive as the apple cart going just fine. Well, what you really fear is the pain and the effort it's going to take to be productive and to be healthy. You know the pain, you know the discomfort, and you know the maladaptive behavior you're involved in now. And too many of us become afraid to actually do it differently. Do you remember the story I told a long time ago about the general and his wife? The couple had been married for 40 years and they sold everything after the general's retirement. They purchased an RV and they set out from the East Coast to enjoy their retirement, to visit family, friends, and sites. Well, if you remember this, then you also remember that they each had a divorce attorney by the time they arrived in the great state of Texas. Don't let this be you. I'm going to cover 7 obstacles to effective listening. In other words, this is what not to do. But I will give you an idea of what to do. It doesn't do any good for someone to tell you you're wrong, criticize you, and then not give you a pathway in which to make it better. So I don't know you personally as a general rule, but I am giving you advice on how to make your relationships more productive and increase happiness in them. So listening is an essential skill for communicating, but it is often hampered by various obstacles that prevent us from fully understanding each other. Effective listening requires more than just hearing words. It involves interpreting, processing, and responding thoughtfully to what is said. However, many obstacles can interfere with this process, ranging from personal biases to manipulative behaviors. In this podcast, we will examine 7 major obstacles to effective listening. They are interrupting, criticism, sarcasm, judging, manipulation, lack of neutrality, listening with a bias, they're slightly different, and relating. We're also going to explore strategies to overcome each of these obstacles for improved communication. Now, before I review these 7 obstacles, let me clarify the primary purpose of effective communication. Despite what so many so-called experts say, effective communication starts and ends with empathy. Empathy is the understanding of the other person's perspective through their eyes. Never commingle with bias or immaculate perception when you listen. And definitely, this does not include relating. So what I'm saying to you, it's not making sure you're understood. That is not effective communication. That is seeking agreement, another behavioral addiction. Okay, so here we go. Number 1, interrupting. Interrupting is probably one of the most common and damaging obstacles to effective listening. When someone interrupts, they prematurely interject their thoughts or opinions without letting the speaker finish. This disrupts the speaker's flow and sends the message that their words are not valued. Think of your children when you talk to them and interrupt. Your spouse, they're trying to tell you something or they're frustrated, and you just interrupt. Well, you just devalued them personally, and their words have no meaning. Interrupting often stems from impatience, or maybe a desire to dominate the conversation, another addictive behavior, or the assumption that the listener already knows what the speakers will say, so you're mind reading. That's a cognitive distortion. So what are the effects of interrupting? Well, you break the train of thought. 2, it prevents the listener from fully understanding the message. And 3, it just causes frustration or resentment in the person doing the interrupting. So, how do you avoid it? 1, practice patience by waiting for the speaker to finish before responding. Maybe count to 3 before you say anything and just watch what happens. A second idea would be use the following techniques like nodding or maintaining eye contact to show that you're engaged but not interjecting a comment. And 3, if need be, take notes during the conversation to capture your thoughts and address them when it's your turn to speak. This technique works great in high stakes or really intense emotional conversations. Interrupting derails meaningful dialogue, but practicing patience and self-control can create a more respectful and productive exchange. The only appropriate time to interrupt is to gain clarity, 1, or 2, to keep the responder within boundaries. You know how people, you ask them a question, they just take off down a rabbit hole? It's okay to bring them back as long as the question that you interrupt them with is back on topic. This is a much more advanced nuance in effective listening and training, and it's actually a nuance in sales and in interpersonal relationships. All right, let's just go into number 2. criticism. Criticism, especially harsh or unnecessary criticism, can significantly hinder listening. When listeners focus on finding flaws in the speaker's message, tone, or delivery, they completely lose sight of the content and meaning. They don't get context, and therefore they're not neutral. For instance, someone might dismiss an important idea simply because they dislike the speaker's style or choice of words. As a note in this story, there is no such thing as constructive criticism. Those two words are polar opposites, so rid yourself of the poor habit of saying, "Can I give you some constructive criticism?" If they didn't ask for it, it's not constructive, it's just criticism. Criticism is also an addiction. So here are some examples. 1, judging the speaker's grammar or pronunciation instead of focusing on their message and context. 2, mentally preparing a rebuttal instead of understanding the speaker's perspective. And 3, dismissing the idea or ideas as wrong without fully understanding their context. How do you overcome it? Well, shift your focus from how the message is delivered to what is being said. Focus on the words, and then try to understand their meaning. 2, don't get caught up in nitpicking minor details. Look at the bigger picture to make sure you're understanding. You're rising above the fray. That is such a classy move, just to pull context out of it. And 3, again, practice empathy. Consider their intent, their context, and their perspective. By reducing unnecessary criticism, listeners can better focus on understanding the speaker and fostering constructive communication. All right, this one, sarcasm, is a toughie. Sarcasm is a euphemism for verbal flogging. If you really want to get the context, look up the word flogging and how it used to be used by the ancient Romans. Sarcasm creates a hostile and a dismissive atmosphere, and it completely shuts down listening. A listener responding sarcastically signals disrespect or indifference towards the speaker's message. It not only undermines trust, but it also discourages open and honest communication. Before I go further, let me give you context. If I'm golfing with my brother and friends that I've known for 40 and sometimes 50 years, I get that there's sarcasm involved. I'm not talking about that. When you're meeting new people or when you're trying to rebuild a relationship, sarcasm has no place at all. Just like relating, no place at all. It creates tension or conflict, it distracts from the actual content, and it makes the speaker feel invalidated or ridiculed. That's what it does. How do you avoid it? Well, use a neutral or supportive tone, even when you disagree. You don't have to agree to understand. That's really critical. There's a difference between understanding and agreeing. Your goal is to understand, not agree. Focus on asking good questions, clarifying questions, instead of making either dismissive remarks or leading or rhetorical questions. And then lastly, be mindful of your voice, your tone, your words, and your body language. Make sure you're coming across respectfully. 4, judging. Judging occurs when listeners form premature opinions about the speaker or their message. This is, again, a cognitive distortion. This obstacle often stems from biases, stereotypes, or preconceived notions. For example, a listener may dismiss a speaker's argument simply because they disagree with their political views or background. So they're already disagreeing before they've even said anything. Judging prevents the listener from engaging with the content of the message, and it also limits your ability to understand alternative perspectives. It's, again, addictive. All of these things create electrochemicals within the body, and the brain cannot differentiate between the chemicals you create when you judge, you interrupt, you use sarcasm or relating, and shooting up with an opioid, a heroin, or taking a drink of vodka. A drug is a drug is a drug. So what are common forms of judging? Labeling the speaker as wrong or unqualified without hearing the full argument. Assuming the speaker's intent based on your stereotypes. Evaluating the speaker's character instead of the message. So how do you overcome that? Approach every conversation, and this requires a lot of practice, and it's easy to practice because all you have to do is open your mouth with someone and start talking to them. Approach every conversation neutrally, with an open mind and a willingness to understand. It doesn't mean you have to be something other than what you are, meaning you don't have to give up a principle. It just means you understand their perspective. Set aside personal biases and focus on the speaker's words, and then practice awareness by questioning your judgments that arise during the conversation. Again, these are not easy to do. It's just that the things that we are doing, the 4 I've mentioned so far, are really harmful. So the next one is, you'll see it a lot in leadership and in sales. It's called manipulation. This is an obstacle to effective listening that arises when one party uses deception or controlling tactics to steer the conversation in a specific direction. Think politics. Think used car salesman. Think timeshare salesman. This behavior undermines trust and prevents genuine communication. For example, a listener might feign interest in the speaker's message only to use the information against them later. Manipulation and its cousin persuasion are both addictive behaviors. We get stuck in this rut of not being completely transparent. What's a sign? A sign is you're twisting the speaker's words to serve hidden agendas. And I can't tell you how often that happens. And the people who do this are in the drama triangle, playing the role of a persecutor, but acting like a victim. They distort and they twist. They take words out of context, pretending to agree or to support the person you're talking to, but you harbor ulterior motives, and then you steer the conversation away from the speaker's intended target. Those are signs of manipulation. How do you avoid it? Okay, we go back to some very common principles. Be honest. Be transparent in your communication. Listen with the intent to understand instead of control the outcome. And respect their autonomy and perspective. You don't always have to be right in a conversation. You're far more powerful and far more influential if you just understand. Number 6, again, a very challenging thing. Lack of neutrality. This occurs when listeners allow their emotions, biases, or personal opinions to cloud their ability to process the person's message. For instance, if a listener strongly disagrees with a topic, let's just take politics. We could even take religion. It doesn't really matter. There's really strong emotions in the world today. So let's just take politics. Let's say you're talking to someone who's the opposite of you as far as your red-blue approach. Typically what happens is you shut down or become defensive instead of engaging in a constructive dialogue, and you make it personal. It's okay to argue points. It's not okay to argue, well, you're just stupid, or you're really misinformed, or I thought you were a lot smarter than that. That's a lack of neutrality. That's judging. That's manipulation. That's name-calling. So what causes it? What causes people to lack neutrality? Well, it's because you become emotional. You're no longer objective. You're trying to be right. And trying to be right and having to be right, very addictive. Another one is you have a pre-existing bias or judgment, either positive or negative, because judging can also be positive, but I'm not going to go into that too much today. And the last one is you over-identify with the topic of the speaker's conversation. You really get into what they're saying, and you're overly committed to that they're right. Well, that's still a lack of neutrality. You're still not trying to understand the truth. And again, that's really taking this down to a cool, granular level. This also happens in politics, where you only listen to one red station or blue station, and all you hear is their point of view. So what are some tips here? Well, how about we practice emotional regulation by pausing before we respond, and pause before we get too caught up emotionally in what they're saying. Let's just understand their position, and then ask yourself, what's the principle here? What is right, not who is right? Remind yourself to focus on just the understanding first before you open your mouth to debate it. And then also separate the content of the message from your personal feelings about the person or the topic that's being discussed. All right. And then lastly, and this is what we started with, so we're bookending this, relating. It's usually well-intended, but it becomes an obstacle to effective listening when it shifts the focus away from the speaker and onto the listener's own experiences. For instance, if a friend shares a personal challenge and the listener immediately responds with a similar story, Well, if it's me telling you a story and you start talking about you, well, I just realized that you're really not a friend because you're making it all about you. And so that's what's going on in relating. And why is it an obstacle? Because the wind is no longer in my sails trying to tell you my story so I could get some help from someone I trust. You've taken all the wind away and you've removed all the attention onto yourself. Now, it's usually not intentional, but it's very addictive. You will trivialize my experiences and maximize your experiences, and I never get my train of thought thoroughly because you keep interrupting me. Now, I could have done that differently and said that I'm the bad guy, but I'm just speaking from the person that if I'm telling a story and this is how I feel when people relate to me, it makes more sense. At least I think it does. So how do you avoid that? Okay, well, let's make the message the most important thing. If someone's telling me a story about a bad time they're having, a challenge, it's critical that they know I'm connecting with them and I'm understanding them. 2, I'm going to ask open-ended questions to encourage the person to elaborate on the experience so I can get to the bottom of it. And 3, I'll be empathetic, not sympathetic. Empathy means I'm going to get it from their perspective. Sympathy is all about me. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry that happened. You can still do that, but let's do that after they know you understand what's going on. So let me kind of bring this all together, and hopefully this is making sense to you. Effective listening requires more than just hearing the words being spoken. It involves understanding, processing, and responding thoughtfully to what the speaker is putting out. The problem is obstacles like interrupting and criticism and sarcasm and judging and manipulation and a bias, the lack of neutrality, and listening with the intent to respond and then relating, they hinder this process and they lead to communication breakdowns. Listeners can create a more respectful and open environment for dialogue by identifying and addressing these obstacles. Just pick one. And then be aware of it, see it in other people, and ask yourself, how do you feel when you see that in someone else? And then recognize that's how they feel when you do it. Strategies such as practicing patience, setting aside biases, avoiding the sarcasm, and really, more than anything else, being empathetic. Really appreciate you listening today. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. We'll send you an ebook on effective communication skills. Share this with a neighbor. And remember, as in all situations, don't try harder to get along, to have good communication skills. Let's do it differently, different than what the traditional way has been doing. Have a great day.